Hello and welcome to the Fantasy Rewind podcast. I'm your host, Dylan Stoll, and I'm joined as always by my friend, Michael Whifford.
What?
Yes,
What?
so you might have noticed that we are in the middle of a soft rebrand, kind of, where we're going to go from being strictly Wheel of Time focused to being more fantasy, science fiction genre focused as a whole here. And so one of the reasons that we're doing this is because we really want to cover The Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power on Amazon Prime when that gets released here, and as well as talk about other fantasy favorites, different books we like, different TV series, different movies. And we thought that by going this route here and kind of reintroducing ourselves as the Fantasy Rewind podcast, that would give us a little bit more of a broader spectrum to operate in and still talk about the things that we love, which, of course, is Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time, fantasy in general. So, Mike, I'm going to toss this to you really quick. What do you want to say about the rebrand?
I'm just super excited. After our kind of conversation with Sean, and, we got off on tangents talking about Animorphs and Avatar, and we both kind of left like, hey, that was really enjoyable, It was really freeing to be able to kind of talk about everything. And, we don't really want to sit here and like every 2 weeks, look for what news we can about the Wheel of Time. We're just like, we want to be able to talk about other stuff too. And we're sure that like most of the community or the people who listen to us are interested in talking about and like learning about other things in fantasy. And we're not by any means claiming to be experts on any of the things we cover. We're just kind of two giant nerds who want to just, share our
passion for fantasy.
Love. Yeah, our passion for fantasy. And I think it just gives us this really great opportunity to do that. So I'm really excited because I know, Dylan, you've read book series that I haven't read, and I've read book series you haven't read, and we've both watched shows that the other probably wouldn't watch. And this also is a great opportunity to get our significant others and even just to watch some shows or movies that we wouldn't normally watch and be able to talk about them and react to them. And I'm really excited to just be immersed in all of this and just share this really cool and nerdy fun with everyone.
Right, and so like Mike just said, we're going to be using this opportunity to kind of dig into, see a lot of cool and unique things. And like we were just talking about the Rankin Bass Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit videos, and if we wanted to watch those and kind of give our breakdowns on those, but we're going to be covering Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power for sure. We will cover season 2 of Amazon's Wheel of Time when that finally gets released here. And we'll still update whenever we hear anything kind of cool about that, because we still both obviously love Wheel of Time and everything. But
yeah, and that may just be like a short, news section too.
Just right, like a little fantasy news that we found out about that we are excited about. Like even if it's like a new video game that's coming out in the Witcher series or something like that.
Yeah.
But we're gonna do like a sort of a reintroduction. And so we are the Fantasy Rewind podcast. My name's Dylan. I live up in Vermont. And I am talking to my friend from elementary school onward, Michael Whitford over here, chilling down in North Carolina right now.
Charlotte, yeah.
And so we're just going to kind of have a little fun here and talk about like some of our favorite things in fantasy. And so to kick this off here, Mike, what would you say, hard question, I know, what is your current favorite fantasy book series that you have read?
Oh gosh. Obviously, like Wheel of Time is always going to be up there in my top list. Currently reading though, and I'm almost done with it, and this is kind of my second reread through it, but the first time was in high school, so I don't know if I would really count it, but I would say probably the Sandman series by Neil Gaiman is the one I'm currently reading that I'm just loving. But as for like epic fantasy series, it would actually have to be probably Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archives.
So right off the bat, that's one of the series that I have not read yet. As shameful as that might sound, I really intend to read the Stormlight Archive. I've bought my
It's
fiance the
it's
first 2 books in the series, and she's going through them right now as well. And when she's done, I'm gonna hop on there. But I have a list of some other fantasy things ahead of that for right now, unfortunately. And it's just I know it's not finished. I'm kind of holding off a little bit. And Patrick Rutherford, I'm looking at you as well. So
Oh
finish your Name of the
man,
Wind and Kingkiller Chronicle, please.
love those books.
But right now, I will say that my favorite fantasy book series that I have read is actually Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire. And
I
so
have not read those.
I will say that they are amazing, but again, we're running into a problem where a beloved author, George R. R. Martin, has not finished this series yet either. So I've not gotten past Dance with Dragons, unfortunately. But I really want to, and I'm really waiting for Dream of Spring and everything else that comes on there, because there's 2 more books that he has been working
holding
on.
hostage.
But yes, that he's not done with yet. Oh, right, going into the next question I have here, and I haven't given Mike these questions ahead of time, so he's coming in blindsided with this as well. What is your favorite fantasy setting?
Ooh, okay. So this is actually probably an easier one, but I'm gonna make it a little more difficult for myself. By setting, you're just meaning like kind of like the universe or like the type of fantasy.
Yeah, like the type of fantasy that you're kind of
Okay.
reading.
So definitely like magic. Like I've read like the sort of the Shannara series. I've read Xanth from Piers Anthony. I've tried reading Game of Thrones, but then I just got lost in the show and just never picked the books back up again. I've read like the Percy Jackson series. So anything really that has to do with like magic and like swords and elves and all of that has kind of been sort of my big draw. But I will say that I haven't really been the biggest fan of like science fiction in terms of like space, but shows like Firefly and Star Wars obviously have been big draws for me, and so I will say like I am interested in that realm, but always really have been more into swords and magic. What about you, Dylan?
So I'm in complete agreement. I am way more drawn to like the pseudo medieval fantasy as like the realm of fantasy that I prefer to dwell in here. And that covers great things like Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time, Game of Thrones, all of those right there. Like they all dwell within that like pseudo medieval fantasy realm. I really do also like it when there is the added bit of magic and everything to make it fantastical. Of course, you have your different races of creatures like dwarves and elves and everything else that I'm not going to name right now. But I really do like that kind of fantasy more than the science fiction fantasy. Although I do still really like some of the ones that you mentioned, like Firefly and Serenity were both good. Talking about Star Wars, of course, you can't talk about that without it. World of Warcraft, you and I had a little dwelling in Azeroth for a little bit. But yeah, I really do like the medieval side of fantasy more than the science fiction side, although I do appreciate both and enjoy both when I do dip my toes in. All right, so next question I have for you is, what is your favorite fantasy television show that you have watched?
Oh, that's a tough one because so many of these end with heartbreak.
Very true.
I just want to come out and say it is not the Sword of Shannara series. We might have to do a episode on that.
I have not watched
point.
that, so I am spared as of right now. But I think it'd be entertaining. I've never read the books for Shannara, no. So I'd be interested in seeing this despised series.
I would very much love for you to. Yeah, that'd be a fun one for you to watch it. For us to watch it and sort of get your take on it, and then for me to just
rip me
talk
apart
about it from a book perspective. No, I don't I don't know if you would really particularly enjoy it either, but anyway, I digress. It'd have to be Game of Thrones, honestly, just because I started watching that. There's just so much tied to it. One, I had watch parties, with you and with Ryan and our friend Ryan Bauer, who is on the Tales from the Cartridge podcast, actually. Great guy. And we would get together and we would watch episodes of Game of Thrones on Sundays. And we had, there's just so much to it.
It really was a cultural phenomenon. And what Game of Thrones did for the fantasy genre has been amazing. And what it was up until the last, 2 seasons was absolutely phenomenal television. And
it's like they couldn't do anything wrong.
Even though the ending has been a bit controversial, and I'm not the greatest fan of the ending, I still have to say that Game of Thrones, for me, is top-tier fantasy television.
I do just want to add on, though, that it was the show.
Yes.
Because I started reading the first book, and it was the show that killed it for me.
Well, okay.
And I know we've had this discussion, but I just want to share it with the people here. I was reading the first book, and I was like, after I'd finished watching season 1, I was like, I'm pretty much just rewatching season 1 again as I'm reading this. And I was like, okay, I'm done. And then you told me, no, you got to keep going.
You got to keep going. You cannot complain about a show staying too faithful to the novels. And that is something that I will not complain about. But what I was going to say, where I thought you were going, was I thought you were going to say that the show got you into the books, which for me, that's how it happened for Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire, is I had not heard of this, and then all of a sudden Mike was like, Dylan, you need to check this show out. So we watched season 1, and I'm just like, sign me up. And I buy all the books, dig right in, and watched it and loved it and read it and loved it ever since.
Yeah, no. For me, I think your experience there, and I think it was actually for both of us, Lord of the Rings.
Yeah,
we watched The Fellowship of the Ring, and then we went out and we started reading it. Me, you, and Justin
had a little competition
in middle school.
Yeah,
reading the entire compendium of the Lord of the Rings. Who
can read the full trilogy first?
Yeah,
and I won that, so I'm happy.
Yes, you did win that. You did win that. Great book, though. Great book.
So next up, what is your favorite fantasy movie?
Oh, Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, duh.
Has to take the cake there with that one. I mean, even though, people will poo-poo on some of it, and they'll drag The Hobbit through the mud too, which, by the way, controversial opinion here, but I'm okay with The Hobbit. I've read The Hobbit more times than I've read The Lord of the Rings.
Me too, yeah.
I'm okay that they took some liberties with it and they added on to it because it is a short book. And yes, people will be like, oh, it was just a whole huge money grab thing because they just wanted to turn it into another 3 movies. But it was really nice that they made the connections between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings.
Right. For me, they took a little bit too much liberty with The Hobbit. And I do see it as a money grab because Peter Jackson was like, let me do it in 2 movies. They're like, no, we'll give you 3. So I still enjoy the Hobbit movies, though, for what they are. But I agree with you. For me, the peak of fantasy cinema has to be the Lord of the Rings extended editions, which, I told you about this, and I just did Lord of the Rings trilogy extended edition all the way watch party by myself over here when my fiance was away for her bachelorette party. I was like, I'm having my own fantasy party here. And so 11 and a half hours later, I emerged on the other side victorious.
You know what series we didn't happen to mention in all this? And I kind of kick myself. And I will say that it is definitely one that I read much later than everyone else. And that was due to things outside of my control. But the Harry Potter series was definitely a book series that had a very profound impact, not just on us, but just our generation.
Yeah.
And really just making fantasy as a whole very mainstream.
Right, and I mean, I gotta give a lot of credit to Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling for coming up with the amazing wizarding world of Harry Potter, because without that, I would not have met my fiance. because when I met my fiance at a Halloween party, and she was dressed up as Hermione. And I was like, okay, I'm talking to her. And so, without J.K. Rowling and without Harry Potter, I mean, say what you want to say about her own personal beliefs, but her fantasy with Harry was great. I liked that a lot. And growing up, Chronicles of Narnia, as well as Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, that was like my bread and butter for my introduction into fantasy when I was a kid.
Oh, yeah. Man, I'm just getting so... I was talking about this, I'm just getting so excited. I'm just sitting here like, you know what? When they finally released the Percy Jackson series on Disney+, going to watch that. I'm going to have to do some episodes on that because that is one of my all-time favorite book series because it just meshes so well. Like, you're talking about how, you know, Harry Potter did that for you. Like, it meshed so well, like, mythology into like fantasy and real life, and it's such a really great series. And I know so many people are really passionate about it, like I am, because Rick Riordan just did such a good job of researching and really integrating all these different myths in such meaningful ways. So I'm just getting excited. Like, I'm just like, Percy Jackson, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings. Ah!
All right, so here's another question for you. All right. Okay. What is your favorite under-the-radar fantasy gem? Can be book, can be show, can be movie. What are you going to go with?
Man, this is such a tough one, Dylan. Because I don't know how under the radar some of these are.
So by under the radar, what I mean is, like, it's not, like, universally loved, like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or something like that.
Hold on, I have to look this up. All right, so I've got two here. Even though I know both of these were book series that were really popular, they're not talked about in the same way that Wheel of Time or any of these other series are. There's no film adaptations that I know of. Not that I've really done too much research on that, or like games or anything else. But the Rift War Cycle by Raymond E. Feist. It's a book series, and it follows around at the beginning this magician pug who's kind of born an orphan, and you know there's a ton of tropes there, but that was just a really fun series that I read, I think in high school actually, and it was after Lord of the Rings, and I just remember over the summer just reading those books, and I don't know if you've ever read a book and you've found a character and you were just like, I want to be just like this character. And you start to sort of take on some of those characteristics from that character. But that was sort of my experience with this book series as I was reading through it, and it's a huge series. So I'm not talking about the whole thing. I'm really more talking about the Rift War saga than anything else. But I had that experience with this series where I was reading it and I was like, I really like this character, which happened to be the prince at the time, and it's a whole thing. It's been a lot of teen angst in there, but it's still to this day one of those series. I went back and I've reread it recently actually, and it holds up surprisingly well, and I just think it would be a really neat series to do because it does have a lot of really interesting elements to it. And then I'm going to circle here my other one. It's actually going to be a video game series, and the lore is just immense, and it's actually not like medieval fantasy. It is sci-fi fantasy, and it is the Destiny series. I absolutely love these games, and the lore in them is so rich, and it's not in your face by any means. You really have to dig for it, but it's just so immense, and there's so much there. And it's such a fun game. I mean, it's made by Bungie, who made Halo, and so it's a very enjoyable game to play, but those would be my two. Even though Destiny's, again, very popular, I would love to see something more done with Destiny in terms of, like, movies or, like, even, like, yeah, in terms of, like, a movie. I just want, like, even books. It would just be really cool to be able to just pour through some of those stories. But what about you, Dylan?
I got a couple for you as well.
Okay.
So, book series-wise, I know I've mentioned this series to you already before, but the Acacia trilogy by David Anthony Durham is pretty good. It's not my favorite by any means, but it is still very solid and very under the radar and does not get as much attention as it deserves. So it's short, it's a finished trilogy, You can bang it all out like pretty easily. So I recommend checking that out for a good solid fantasy read. Next up, movie wise, I'm going with Warcraft. Like the movie that came out like 10 years ago maybe did not do nearly as well as I thought it did. I watched that. I absolutely loved it. I thought it was so good. What were your thoughts on Warcraft?
Oh man, I mean, obviously we have a lot of ties to the video game, and I think the Warcraft story in general is really well done. I haven't played the last few games, so I can't really speak to that, but, and I would love to actually talk about that at one point, the story. They've made a lot of books for it, and I just haven't really dug into a lot of them. But it's such a complex world, and Blizzard and Activision, like obviously there was a whole lot of drama, not drama. There's a lot of issues they had in the workplace, and they needed to figure that all out. And hopefully by selling themselves to Microsoft, they'll fix that. Which hopefully fingers crossed that Microsoft will add World of Warcraft to Game Pass, because if that's the case, then
please do that.
I'm going to be playing again. Include that with my Game Pass subscription. But they just do such a good job building worlds. You take any of their games, StarCraft, the story in StarCraft is so good. Overwatch, even though like you're like, oh, there's no story to that game, like they've done such a good job of making these characters so interesting, and even the short clips and stuff, you're just like, oh wow, like I want to know more.
You're just digging. You want more info.
Yes, and so that's the same thing Destiny has done too. Is really kind of built a universe like that, and so that I just wanted to loop it back to that, but. Yeah, I love those picks there, Dylan.
So I got one more deep dive for you, and this is a throwback one here.
Oh gosh,
Champions of Norath.
Oh gosh,
the PlayStation 2
realms. That's in the Forgotten Realms universe, which is again, it's a big universe, but like you said, there's not so much going on there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fairly empty space right now, but I just remember playing that game hours and hours and hours on end. Like, that was...
having that fantasy story.
Yeah. All right, so do you have any other, like, big things that you think we should hit before we get on out of here, Mike?
Yeah, I would just want to say, we're still kind of, sort of planning this out. We know our next thing is definitely going to be Lord of the Rings as we're jumping in here, and I'm excited to really dive into that a little bit with you, Dylan, as I haven't done a rewatch of those movies in a long time. Like you said at the beginning there, I would very much advocate for us to do a dive-in of the trilogy itself. Maybe we get into the Hobbit trilogy too, if we have some time with that. And the animated ones would be really fun. And if we could figure out a way to do some like reaction videos or something like that, I think that would be really cool.
That could be fun, yeah. The one thing I also want to make sure we address here is that, as well as a little bit of a rebrand with Fantasy Rewind Podcast, we are also having a rebrand in our social handles. So, if you'd like to get in contact with the show here, talking fantasy, Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time, anything else you could think of here. So we are going to be on Twitter at Fantasy Rewind. We're going to be on Instagram at Fantasy Rewind Pod, P-O-D. So that's going to be the best ways to get in contact with us. Send us a DM, send us a comment, tag us in something. We're always down to chat some fantasy goodness with you guys.
Yeah.
All right, well, I guess this is the part where I would usually say see you at the next turning of the wheel, but for now, I guess I'll just say goodbye as I think of something else to fit in here. So,
Two nerds signing off.
All right,
see ya.
Bye.